Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you, as always, from the sunny climes of Western Japan here in November of 2024, with another edition of Questions for Corbett, that regular series where you send in the questions and I provide the answers. And this week's question comes in from the mailbag from a listener named Leilani, who writes, "Hello, James. I have loved listening to your reports online, and I deeply respect your open source research. I do have a question that I would love for you to address." Well, thank you. That's why I'm here. Okay, years ago, I learned that damaging holes had developed in Earth's ozone layer, thereby threatening a protection for our atmosphere. It's really hard to track this now because there is so much fake news and false information out there. The big battle of global warming / cooling climate change has taken over. But what about the holes in the ozone? Not a word. I wonder what is the condition of these ozone holes now. Logic dictates that they have grown larger, but this is never mentioned anywhere, probably because the oil corporations rule media, governments, etc., and they could have liability. So, James, I'm asking you to research the ozone holes, and please find out what is the current status, and what is the science of ozone holes that is affecting us now. It would not make sense that they have mysteriously closed up or have no effect. Thank you for all your excellent work. Excellent. Good question. Thank you, Leilani. And I say this is a good question because I know there are going to be people out there in the audience who have this question, even if they didn't realize they have it, because they, like me, was a child of the 80s. When I remember growing up in the 80s, when the big scare was the ozone hole. Oh my god, there's a hole in the ozone layer, and we're all gonna fry because it's just gonna grow larger and larger until there's no ozone layer at all. UV rays are gonna just melt us all into puddles on the floor. We're all gonna be dead in a generation if something is not done to stop this. And then, after that was drilled into you, fear, it kind of, yeah, what happened to that? But I have the added advantage of remembering and noticing, consciously making a note of it, and I remember this to this day. At some point, it must have been in the early 1990s, so I would have been a young teenager at this point. I remember a brief snippet on the evening news, the local newscast, right before they sent it off to Bill with the weather. The news announcer was, reports are coming in that the hole in the ozone layer over the Antarctic is mysteriously repairing itself, and scientists don't understand why. And now Bill with the weather. And that was literally it. And I remember, even as a very young man at that point, I remember thinking, hey, that doesn't quite add up, because I remember the huge existential threat that this supposedly was going to wipe out civilization. Humanity as we know it was not going to be able to continue, and now it gets barely a sentence or two at the end of the news report as an aside. Oh, by the way, I guess that was baloney. Okay, moving right along. So this is a question I have had over the years too, so I'm glad Leilani brought this up so that we can go into this information together. And in order to do that, why don't we start at the most mainstreamy of mainstream sources, Smithsonian Magazine, to get the skinny on the ozone hole, which was super scary. So what happened to it? Good question. When the ozone hole was discovered, it became a worldwide sensation. 30 years later, well, what's become of it? Okay, let's go through this article together. So it starts by talking about the climate change in general and the atmospheric science surrounding the ozone hole and what it does or does not say. It was the void that changed public perception of the environment forever. A growing spot so scary, it mobilized a generation of scientists and brought the world together to battle a threat to our atmosphere. But 30 years after its discovery, the ozone hole just doesn't have the horror story connotations it once did. How did the conversation change? And how bad is the ozone hole today? Good question, Smithsonian. Tell us all about it. So they go on to talk about atmospheric science and the development of, the discovery of ozone. Eventually, ozone was discovered to be a gas made from 3 oxygen atoms, and scientists began to speculate that it was a critical component of the atmosphere, and even that it was able to absorb the sun's rays. And then there was some more measurements taken, and calculations. And then, because it blocks some radiation from reaching Earth's surface, ozone provides critical protection from the sun's scorching rays. If there were no ozone in the atmosphere, writes NASA, the sun's intense UV rays would sterilize the Earth's surface. So this is why it's such an existential threat if there's a big hole in the ozone layer, right? And then here it gets to the meat and potatoes. Over the years, scientists learned that the layer is extremely thin, that it varies over the course of days and seasons. Knock, 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 hello? Varies? And that it has different concentrations over different areas. Okay, so there's some nuance going on into this story. It's not just a blanket that has a big hole in it. There's something else going on here. But anyway, then they started to question, well, is it capable of being depleted? And if so, maybe the shuttle launch and supersonic aircraft and other exotic forms of contrails in the upper atmosphere, maybe that's depleting the ozone layer. But then they found out, it turned out the contrails weren't the ozone layer's worst enemy. The real danger was contained in things like bottles of hairspray and cans of shaving cream. In 1974, a landmark paper showed that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, used in spray bottles destroy atmospheric ozone. The discovery earned Paul Crutzen, Mario Molina, and F. Sherwood Rowland a Nobel Prize, and all eyes turned to the invisible layer surrounding Earth. But what they found shocked even scientists who were convinced that CFCs deplete ozone, implying that there were scientists that weren't convinced, despite the supposed Nobel victory here. Maybe there's more to say about that. Richard Farman, an atmospheric scientist who had been collecting data in Antarctica annually for decades, thought his instruments were broken when they began to show drastic drops in ozone over the continent. They weren't. The ozone layer had been damaged more than scientists could have imagined before Farman discovered the hole. And then it goes on to talk about what eventuated from this discovery. They talked about how the ozone hole was leaked through the media, which is an interesting choice of words because it makes it sound like this was the secret thing that no one wanted to say, but somehow some intrepid reporter got it out there. Meanwhile, me growing up in the 80s, I remember the constant fear campaign. It was on every program. Oh my God, the ozone hole. It became nothing short of a worldwide sensation, yes, because it was leaked through the media, right? And then they talk about the scientists' well-being at the South Pole, oh my God. Rumors of blind sheep, because the increased radiation was thought to cause cataracts. The sheep are going blind. It's because of the ozone hole, I tell you. It's like AIDS from the sky, a terrified environmentalist told Newsweek staff, with a link there for you to check it out for yourself. Fueled in part by fears of the ozone hole worsening, 24 nations signed the Montreal Protocol limiting the use of CFCs in 1987. And I believe hundreds more signed up, or 100 plus more signed up eventually. Anyway. But these days, scientists understand a lot more about the ozone hole. You know, back when we were freaking out, an existential threat, we have to give up life as we know it, or at least your hairspray, in order to counter this threat. Well, now we actually understand a little bit about what's going on, or at least a little bit more, and now we know it's a seasonal phenomenon. As weather cools during Antarctic winter, the hole gradually recovers until next year. And the hole isn't the Antarctic hole isn't alone. A mini hole was spotted over Tibet in 2003, and in 2005, scientists confirmed thinning over the Arctic so drastic it could be considered a hole. Interesting. They keep talking about the hole, but there's more to say about that. What is the hole? Anyway, each year during ozone hole season, scientists from around the world track the depletion of the ozone above Antarctica using balloons, satellites, and computer models. They have found that the ozone hole is actually getting smaller. Remember what Leilani said? Wouldn't it? It makes no sense. It couldn't be possible that it's getting smaller or that it's not a problem. It couldn't be, because we would have heard about it, right? That would have been leaked through the media, wouldn't it? Scientists estimate that if the Montreal Protocol had never been implemented, the hole would have grown by 40% by 2013. Instead, the hole is expected to completely heal by 2050. Notice the sleight of hand that's going on here, and this is exactly what I talked about years ago on Propaganda Watch, you will recall, where I talked about same data, different conclusions, whatever the title of that Propaganda Watch episode was, in which I pointed out you could talk till you're blue in the face. Oh my God, X million people died as a result of the lockdowns. But if there hadn't have been lockdown, lockdowns, it would have been 7x number of people died, 7x million, whatever it is. They can just make up any number they want because you can't disprove the negative. How are you ever going to disprove this statement? It would have been so much worse if we didn't do that thing that we did. Really? Trust me, bro. Trust the science. Since the hole opens and closes and is subject to annual variances, airflow patterns, and other atmospheric dynamics, it can be hard to keep in the public consciousness. Ding, ding, ding. That, my friends, is the money quote of this whole article, because I think it reveals what is really going on here. Yes, it's hard to keep the scare in people's consciousness if it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more nuanced than, there's a hole and it's getting bigger because you're using hairspray. Oh, we stopped using hairspray and now it's fine, right? I guess that we can go with that narrative, right? But it has to be the story that keeps it in people's brains as either an existential threat or something that was solved or whatever it is. We have to have that. It cannot be a natural atmospheric climactic variation with a number of variabilities and seasonal variants and things like this. And oh, by the way, is the hole really a hole? Etc. There's a lot to go into. But anyway. All right. So that really is what this is about. And then they go on to talk about an interesting quote, I think, from this Brian Johnson at NOAA, who says there are 3 phases to atmospheric concerns. First, there was acid rain. I remember that scare from the 80s. Then it was the ozone hole. I remember that scare. Now it's greenhouse gases like CO2. Actually, I would say now it's methane and cow burps and, other things, because now it's all about you don't eat the bugs or whatever the next phase of this agenda is. So they have to keep the scare boogeyman moving so that you never get actually onto the scheme that's going on. And then the writer says there's a downside to the hole's lower profile. The success story, because remember, it was the Montreal Protocol and the banning of CFCs and hairsprays and what have you that was the thing that solved this problem. The success story could make the public more complacent about other atmospheric emergencies like climate change. So again, this is the whole point of this, really, right? How do we keep the public scared enough to continue giving us money and resources and everything we need in order to control as much of the world as possible? We have to keep the continuous emergency going in people's minds, and the ozone scare wasn't enough to do that. So, if it isn't this existential threat that's absolutely getting worse and is going to kill us all, then how do we convince people about the next existential threat that's going to kill us all, right? And so the rest of the article is just about, oh my god, people aren't scared enough about climate change. Surprise, surprise. Smithsonian Mag, everyone. Give them a big round of applause. Maybe we can find some better sources on this. Like, I don't know, how about What's Up With That posted this: the ozone scare was a dry run for the global warming scare 9 years ago, and this is by Dr. Timball, who, well, you should know by now. If you do not, please check my archives for my many interviews with Dr. Timball, or maybe my Remembering Timball podcast. May he rest in peace. The dearly departed Dr. Timball 9 years ago was writing about this, and he opens up his article with that quotation from the Club of Rome, the First Global Revolution, which I'd like to think is infamous by now. I've done my part in making it as infamous as I can anyway. You've heard it before, let's hear it again. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. To which, Dr. Ball observes, why do we need a new enemy? First, they create the false or exaggerated problem, then they offer the solution. It's wrapped in the guilt that you caused it, but they offer salvation. Give us control and money so we can save you and the planet. Like all religious leaders, they claim the power of absolution. Pass the collection plate. Exactly. Well, then he troubles the narrative with a little bit of actual science, showing a figure that shows the measurement of ozone layer thickness that's measured in Dobson units, and 300 Dobson units. The healthy green area is the sort of global average, but over the Antarctic it's this blue, which is about 150 Dobson units, as in about half of the the global average of the ozone layer. And what that means, if you compress the ozone down to the surface at 0 degrees Celsius and 1 atmospheric pressure, you would have, at 300 Dobson units, you would have a layer of ozone 3 millimeters thick. So in the Antarctic, that's 150 Dobson units. I guess it would be 1.5 millimeters thick. So it is not actually a hole. It is a layer of slightly thinner ozone coverage, but it is not actually a hole. And then he goes on to observe the entire story of ozone depletion due to chlorofluorocarbons was just that, a story, a scientifically created deception. It was a forerunner and a template for the much larger deception of global warming entirely due to human-produced CO2. Now the evidence, much of which was known at the start but deliberately ignored, is emerging. And he starts going through this evidence. He talks, for example, about NASA GISS is now talking about how the hole isn't growing substantially larger, but it isn't actually recovering, clearly growing smaller each year. It's doing that natural variation that the hole, which isn't a hole, apparently does. And they admit that meteorology, not chemistry, was responsible for the increased ozone and resulting smaller hole, as ozone-depleting substances that year were still elevated. So they go on to talk about how, well, actually, it doesn't seem to be a correlation between that whole CFC thing and the size of this hole, which isn't a hole. But contrast that to what they were saying in 2003, which was the exact opposite. The rate at which ozone is being destroyed in the upper atmosphere is slowing, and the levels of ozone-destroying chlorine in that layer of the atmosphere have peaked and are going down. The first clear evidence that a worldwide reduction in chlorofluorocarbon pollution is having the desired effect. So 20 years ago, they were saying, hey, we did it. It was clearly the Montreal Protocol that saved the world. And now they're saying, well, actually, it's just this natural climate variation and has atmospheric variables. Anyway, then Dr. Ball gets into the actual science of this, what ozone is and how it's created and destroyed and what's going on in the upper atmosphere, etc., external societal dynamics of deception, and he talks about his own battles against various scientists over the years who have their bread buttered on the humanity is the enemy of man side of the argument. He talks about false assumptions. Global warming and ozone thinning began with a hypothesis, and in both cases were supported by completely false assumptions designed to predetermine and isolate a human cause. And so he talks about that and about that in the context of the climate change scare and then also in the ozone scare. He makes the point that Kreutzer, Molina, and Rowland, remember they won the Nobel Prize, according to the Smithsonian Mag, they won the Nobel Prize for discovering the CFC ozone link. And Dr. Ball makes the point, well, they produced the science necessary to point the fingers at CFCs, but the prize does not specify that it was given for destruction of ozone in the ozone layer. They didn't and couldn't simulate atmospheric conditions in the ozone layer. With the pseudo-scientific evidence, the political agenda could proceed. And then he talks again about the parallels with the AGW, anthropogenic global warming hypothesis. They ignored variations in ultraviolet radiation, which we know is the major cause of variation. So again, like the climate change narrative, there can't be any natural explanation for what's going on. There cannot be anything that is not human caused. They talk about the precise chemistry and details of PSCs. Polar stratospheric clouds are not understood. We do not yet fully understand the mechanism for PSC freezing. This remains one of the largest uncertainties in stratospheric ozone modeling. So, we can't even come up with these phony baloney models that tell us whatever we want with any reliability. But trust us, guys, the science was settled, and it was the Montreal Protocol that saved us all. Anyway, he goes through a lot of these types of deceptions, and I will, of course, link up this article so you can go and read through it on your own time. But yeah, the ozone scare was a dry run for the global warming scare. And I think that's an important point of this. But in case any more evidence was needed, in case we needed a kicker on all of this, just a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, What's Up With That had this from Steve Gorham. Scientists haven't saved the ozone layer. And It starts by noting in 2015, scientists at NASA predicted the ozone hole would be half closed by 2020. That hasn't happened. Other scientists have forecasted the hole will not begin to disappear until 2040 or later. But the longer the hole persists, the greater the likelihood that the ozone layer is dominated by natural factors, not human CFC emissions. And there's a lot of science here and what have you, but here's the long story short. Here is the world ozone depleting substance consumption and ozone hole area from 1979 to 2023. So here's the ozone hole, which, again, let's keep in mind it's not a hole. That's just one of those words that they like to use. But anyway, here's the thickness of the ozone layer over Antarctica. And here's ODS, the ozone depleting substance consumption, CFCs and what have you. And you'll notice that goes off a cliff. Yeah, well, the Montreal Protocol certainly did decrease CFCs and other ODSs in the atmosphere, but that has absolutely zero discernible effect on the trend line here. It's just continuing to do what it always does with its seasonal variation, thinning and thickening and thinning and thickening and thinning and thickening. And as this points out, the longer this continues, the longer there is no discernible correlation whatsoever between ODS and the ozone quote-unquote hole, the more obvious it is that there is natural variation at play here that has nothing to do with these man-made chemicals. So, anyway, that is precisely why you do not hear about the ozone hole anymore. This narrative that is shaping up right now no longer fits the scare narrative. If it was still, oh my god, the hole is still getting bigger and bigger and we're all going to die, they would definitely be telling you about that on the news every night. Not because they're concerned about you, but because they're concerned about getting control over you. Because absolutely the narrative would be, whatever. Oh, we've discovered that this new... It turns out when you eat meat, the weather gods get angry and the ozone hole opens, or whatever. Pray to us and we'll sacrifice someone on the top of the pyramid and throw their body down and appease the gods. It's the same trick that's been used for thousands of years, folks, in case you haven't noticed. But anyway, they would be absolutely hyping that. Or if it was, nope, the ozone hole completely cleared, the ozone hole completely closed up the moment that we stopped with CFCs. It's clear correlation. You can see it on the graph. They would definitely tell you that too, because that would also fit a narrative. Hey, look, see, you gave us control. We signed, all the nations of the world came together to sign this pledge, and we handled the problem. They would trumpet that too, because then they could say, now we need the same power to do that with climate. But they can't do either, because it turns out, actually, there's obviously variables here that we don't know and can't account for, and natural variation, and it goes up and down, and so it's kind of a meh story. Oh my god, it's almost like humans don't control the entire global atmospheric system and everything to do. We don't have the thermostat that magically raises and lowers the temperature of the entire Earth. Wow. Maybe it has to do with things like the sun, that gigantic ball of energy that provides all of the energy for our solar system. Maybe it has something to do with, variations in that or something. No, that's crazy talk. It has to be whether you drive a car to work or not. Anyway, that is why, Leilani and everyone else, you don't hear about the ozone hole problem anymore. It's because it does not fit the narrative. And so the media isn't leaking any details about it because it doesn't serve anyone's purpose at this point. And it's not, in this case, big oil that, oh my god, will have liability somehow for the ozone layer thinning. I don't know how that would work, but even if it did, it's not that. It's because it doesn't serve the interest of the United Nations and the globalists and the people who want to control the Club of Roamers and the people who want to control you and your attitudes and behavior, as they say in that Club of Rome quote. It's all about controlling your attitudes and behavior by making humanity the enemy of man. Well, anyway, good news, guys. The ozone hole isn't a hole. And there's natural variation that goes on, and there's no discernible effect between human ODSs, ozone-depleting substances, and the size of this hole. So, scare story over. We don't have to live in dread like... I don't think I was living in dread as a child, but at any rate, it was certainly something I thought about. Acid rain and ozone hole, and oh my god, we're destroying the Earth, was something that definitely preoccupied me, and I know... other people probably much more profoundly affected. And now I can't even imagine children growing up right now with the amount of propaganda about how we're absolutely, we've destroyed the entire ecosystem of the Earth with our magical thermostat. We're just turning it all the way up. Good news, guys. No, this existential threat to humanity is not an existential threat to humanity, at least not discernibly, not at this point. So you can take that off of your burner of, oh my god, I must be fascinated and worried about this, but make note of the way that you were manipulated, because the fundamental point here is they, them, those will tell you what to be afraid of and when to be afraid of it and how much to be afraid of it. And if you deviate from any one of those three factors, you're too afraid of it, or you're not afraid enough, or you're afraid at the wrong time. If you're still thinking about the ozone hole, then you're a disinformationist, weirdo, kook. Just trust the science, which means whatever the media tells you scientists are saying this week is what you need to believe. Well, I'll let you make up your own mind on whether or not you want to trust the science on this or any other issue, but I think we'll leave this exploration here for today. As always, the links to these articles will be in the show notes, so in case you want to research and get further into the details for yourselves, I would highly encourage that. But that's going to do it for today. I'm James Corbett at CorbettReport.com. Looking forward to talking to you again in the near future.